January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him, an intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber bearing the tail number 76312. This cannot be their standard design. No Air Force would build bombers this way. The fuselage gleamed in the tropical sun, its distinctive cylindrical shape justifying its Allied nickname. Measuring nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber sat on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar resting on the tarmac. The wings, spanning 25 meters tip to tip, showed no battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder radials producing 1,500 horsepower each, appeared intact. This was not a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This was a complete, operational bomber abandoned by its crew during the American advance on Clark Field. But what had captured McCoy's complete attention, what would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered when he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, would expose a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, about the value Imperial forces placed on crew survival, was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single pristine example of Japan's most important bomber. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target was Clark Field itself, the American primary air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, Zero fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing run. Of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter plane was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew to the north. What struck me was how they came in. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. But the Betty bombers themselves had departed untouched. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated their bombers' exceptional range, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no Allied bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's first year of combat would prove devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field raid, 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M Nell bombers in attacking Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with a precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead. The torpedoes were designed specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths that could strike ships even in coastal waters. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with damage from leveled bombers. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hull. Flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse, a battlecruiser built during World War I but modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese aircraft but could not prevent the coordinated torpedo runs from finding their targets. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours of the attack. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20 hours. Repulse followed at approximately 13:33 hours. 841 British sailors died. The survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Across the Pacific theater through early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in every major engagement. The aircraft seemed to operate with impunity, striking targets at ranges that defied conventional understanding. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away, demonstrating a reach that exceeded any Allied bomber capability at that stage of the war. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges, maintaining pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across vast ocean expanses. The Betty's range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. American fighters based at forward positions lacked the range to intercept Betty bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that themselves were beyond Allied striking range. The asymmetry in bomber capability meant that Japanese forces could attack at will, while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted through the first half of the war. Betty bombers participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck targets in the Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They performed reconnaissance missions that exceeded the range of any Allied aircraft. The Betty became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness. But the advantage depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft guns, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained limited and dispersed. But by mid-1942, the tactical picture began to change. As American fighter strength increased, as Wildcat fighters gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses.
The shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in what would become the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons: Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had transformed completely. First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases that enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in what became a sustained bloodletting that Japanese air forces could not sustain. The single mission on August 8th alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft, with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations would depart from Repulse, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more losses. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Repulse, but every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involved casualties. But the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damaged but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30-millimeter rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Repulse to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the mission after one aircraft blew a tire on takeoff and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing would result in mission failure. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 0725 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with a precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 0934 hours, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38 spotted the Yamamoto formation, 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers, while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute precision over 400 miles of open ocean. American fighters had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigational challenges. And the Betty's vulnerabilities guaranteed that a successful intercept would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bombers surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage would be catastrophic. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanaya Base Air Base, each carrying an Oka bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour towards American ships. The warhead's 1,200 kilograms of explosives would destroy any vessel it struck. But the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed from Kanaya at approximately 3:30 hours. The 18 G4M bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort heading towards American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability.
The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range for the Oka weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Beatty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed at Sugi Airfield carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft, given call signs Baton-1 and Baton-2, flew to Aishima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs Baton-1 and Baton-2 referenced the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Densudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The transport variants retained the Betty's distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. The flight from Atsugi to Aishima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout their flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any deviation from planned routes. The White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. The Betty's production statistics reflect both the aircraft's importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of its design philosophy. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, though some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. The variation in total numbers reflects different methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. The G4M Model 1 comprised approximately 1,172 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with a capacity of 4,780 liters. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-range bomber in service anywhere in the world, but the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. The G4M Model 2, with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed, accounted for approximately 1,142 examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending maximum range even further. Top speed increased slightly to 437 kilometers per hour, but the Model 2 retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. The G4M Model 3, designated Model 34, represented the only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war end. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. The G6M transport variant, converted from bomber airframes, added another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. The G6M Model 1, used for one of the surrender aircraft in August 1945, represented this variant. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production decreased in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, exceeded only by some fighter types in total production. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that numbered in the hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. The casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating, though exact numbers remain difficult to verify from available records. What is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. The crew understood these odds and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded that they accept the risks regardless of consequences. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masawato, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.51 inches thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier position featured armored glass. Waist gun positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17 C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms reflected the substantial weight penalty for protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty. Despite similar size and role, the weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Armor body vests reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire.